The night of March 10th, 1967, was darker than most in Tay Ninh province, with heavy clouds obscuring whatever moon might have provided some natural illumination to the men of Fire Support Base 2 at Prek Klok, who were preparing for what they hoped would be another routine evening of perimeter defense along Route 4. The main highway that connected the American bases scattered throughout this contested region of South Vietnam, known as War Zone C. The fire base itself was a relatively small installation by American standards, nothing more than a circular defensive position that the soldiers sometimes called a wagon train, with M113 armored personnel carriers arranged in a protective ring around the artillery pieces of the 2nd Battalion, 33rd Artillery Regiment, whose mission was to provide fire support for infantry operations throughout the area, while also serving as a base of operations for the engineers who were busy constructing a special forces camp and an airfield nearby. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Daniel commanded the artillery battalion inside the perimeter, while Lieutenant Colonel Edward Collins commanded the mechanized infantry battalion of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Infantry Regiment, that provided security for the fire base. And both officers understood that their position, though well defended by American standards, represented a tempting target for the Viet Cong forces that had been moving through the area with increasing frequency since Operation Junction City had kicked off just 2 weeks earlier. The fire base sat approximately 20 kilometers north of Nguy Ba Den, the massive mountain that dominated the flat terrain of Tay Ninh province like some ancient volcanic sentinel rising from the jungle floor. And this mountain had been a stronghold for guerrilla fighters going back more than a century, serving as a base for rebel movements opposed to the ruling Nguyen dynasty during the 19th century, then for Viet Minh fighters during the French Indochina War, and now for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces that used its caves and jungle-covered slopes as a sanctuary from American firepower. The Americans knew that enemy forces were in the area because intelligence reports had been picking up increased radio traffic and movement. But intelligence reports in Vietnam were often vague and unreliable, telling you that the enemy was somewhere out there in the jungle without giving you enough specific information to do anything about it until the shooting actually started. The soldiers manning the perimeter that night included infantry from Company B of the Mechanized Battalion, along with other elements scattered around the defensive positions, and they had established their fighting positions and set out their claymore mines and established their fields of fire just as they had done countless times before, following the standard operating procedures that the Army had developed for fire-based defense through hard experience in this war. What these men didn't know, what they couldn't know despite all their intelligence assets and radio intercepts and aerial reconnaissance, was that 2 full battalions of the Viet Cong, 272nd Regiment, were maneuvering through the jungle darkness toward their position at that very moment, moving with the kind of tactical skill and discipline that came from years of fighting first against the French and then against the Americans, coordinating their approach from multiple directions, so that when they launched their assault, it would come from the north and the east, and then from the southwest, creating a situation where the defenders would be taking fire from 3 sides simultaneously, and would have difficulty bringing their superior firepower to bear effectively. The communist commanders had studied this fire base carefully, had observed the American patterns and procedures, had noted the positions of the artillery pieces and the armored personnel carriers and the command bunkers, and they had developed a plan that they believed would allow them to overrun the position before American reinforcements could arrive, or before the massive American firepower advantage could turn the tide of battle. They knew that the Americans had artillery at other bases in the area, knew that American aircraft could be overhead within minutes once a contact was initiated. But they also knew that if they could get close enough to the American positions quickly enough, they could negate some of that advantage by making it difficult for the Americans to call in artillery and airstrikes without risking hitting their own men. To understand what happened at Prek Klok in February and March of 1967, you have to understand the broader strategic situation that brought American forces into War Zone C in the first place. And that requires going back to the fundamental challenge that faced American military commanders in Vietnam throughout the war, which was the question of how to bring superior American firepower and technology to bear against an enemy that refused to fight conventional battles and instead relied on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and the ability to disappear into the civilian population or across borders into sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos, where American forces were not permitted to pursue them. War Zone C was a roughly 300-square-mile patch of flat, semi-forested terrain just south of the Cambodian border, between routes 22 and 4, and it had been a Viet Cong stronghold since the early days of the insurgency, a place where communist forces could establish base camps and supply depots and training facilities relatively safe from South Vietnamese government control, close enough to the Cambodian border that they could retreat across the frontier if American or South Vietnamese forces mounted a major operation against them. American intelligence believed that somewhere in War Zone C was the Central Office for South Vietnam, known by its acronym COSVN, which was thought to be the supreme headquarters controlling all communist military and political activities in South Vietnam. And American analysts imagined this headquarters as something like a mini Pentagon, complete with typists and file cabinets and staff officers with maps and communications equipment, protected by a large guard force and operating from some kind of permanent installation in the jungle. The reality, as the Americans would eventually learn but hadn't yet fully understood in early 1967, was that COSVN was much more mobile and decentralized than they imagined, consisting of small groups of officers and political cadres who moved frequently to avoid detection and who could quickly disperse and relocate if they came under threat. But the belief that COSVN was out there somewhere in War Zone C, waiting to be found and destroyed, was one of the primary motivations behind Operation Junction City. General William Westmoreland, who commanded the Military Assistance Command Vietnam and was the overall American military commander in the country, had been pushing since 1966 for a strategy that focused on what he called the Big Unit War, meaning large-scale search and destroy operations using multi-division American forces to find and engage main force Viet Cong and North Vietnamese units in decisive battles where American firepower superiority would inflict such heavy casualties that the enemy would be forced to abandon their attempts to forcibly reunify Vietnam under communist control. Westmoreland believed, or at least argued publicly, that if American forces could make the war costly enough for Hanoi by destroying enough of their combat units and killing enough of their soldiers, the North Vietnamese leadership would eventually conclude that they couldn't win and would agree to a negotiated settlement that would leave South Vietnam independent. And this strategy of attrition required American forces to take the offensive, to go out into the countryside and the jungles and search for enemy units and bring them to battle. The problem with this strategy, which wouldn't become fully apparent until later in the war, but which some officers understood even in 1967, was that it assumed the enemy would cooperate by accepting battle on terms favorable to American firepower, and it assumed that there was some level of casualties that would be unacceptable to the North Vietnamese leadership. And both of those assumptions turned out to be fundamentally flawed because the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces had no intention of fighting pitched battles where American artillery and air power could destroy them. and because the North Vietnamese leadership had demonstrated through decades of fighting first against the French and then against the Americans that they were willing to accept essentially unlimited casualties in pursuit of their goal of reunifying Vietnam under their control. But in early 1967, Westmoreland's strategy was still official American policy, and that strategy required large-scale offensive operations like Junction City. Operation Junction City was conceived as the largest American military operation of the Vietnam War to that point, involving the equivalent of nearly 3 divisions of American troops along with supporting South Vietnamese forces. And it represented General Westmoreland's attempt to implement his big unit war strategy on a massive scale by creating conditions where enemy forces would have no choice but to stand and fight or be destroyed trying to escape. The operation was planned by Lieutenant General Jonathan Seaman, who commanded 2nd Field Force Vietnam, which was responsible for American military operations in the southern half of South Vietnam, and Westmoreland had specifically directed Seaman to think big, to plan an operation that would involve maximum force and create maximum pressure on enemy forces in War Zone C. The operational concept that Seaman's staff developed was what they called a hammer and anvil approach, where American forces would establish a blocking position in the shape of a horseshoe around the northern, eastern, and western sides of War Zone C, creating an anvil against which other American forces, the hammer, would drive the enemy by sweeping north from the open southern end of the horseshoe, theoretically trapping Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces between the hammer and the anvil, where they could be engaged and destroyed by superior American firepower. The forces assembled for Junction City represented a truly massive commitment of American combat power, including most of the 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, and one of the most storied divisions in American military history, the 25th Infantry Division, the 3rd Brigade of the 4th Infantry Division, the 196th Light Infantry Brigade, the airborne troops of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and elements of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, along with supporting artillery, aviation, and logistics units that brought the total American force to something like 30,000 soldiers, backed by the full might of American air power, including tactical fighters, bombers, and the massive B-52 strategic bombers that could drop enormous bomb loads on suspected enemy positions. The plan called for these forces to be positioned around War Zone C on the morning of February 22nd, 1967, with the blocking forces moving into position via helicopter air assaults and the 173rd Airborne Brigade conducting a combat parachute jump, the first American combat jump since the Korean War and the only combat jump of the entire Vietnam War, while the Hammer forces would begin their northward sweep, designed to flush enemy forces out of their base camps and supply depots. The Viet Cong forces available to defend War Zone C were considerably smaller than the American force arrayed against them, consisting of 4 regiments, including HOSVN's Guard unit, known as the 75th Guard Regiment, the 101st Infantry Regiment, and 2 regiments of the 9th Viet Cong Division, specifically the 271st and 272nd Regiments, with the 3rd Regiment of the 9th Division, the 273rd Regiment, held in reserve in War Zone D to the east. And this mismatch in forces was intentional because American planners believed that if they could fix these enemy forces in place and bring American firepower to bear, they could inflict decisive casualties that would seriously degrade enemy capabilities in the region. What American planners didn't fully appreciate, though they should have based on years of experience fighting in Vietnam by this point, was that the Viet Cong had excellent intelligence networks that included sources deep within the South Vietnamese government and military. which meant that they often knew about American operations before they began or shortly after they were launched, and that the Viet Cong commanders had no intention of allowing their forces to be trapped and destroyed in the kind of conventional battle that would favor American firepower. General Nguyen Chi Thanh, who commanded communist military forces in South Vietnam and was in many ways General Westmoreland's opposite number, understood perfectly well what the Americans were trying to do with Junction City, and he had no interest in cooperating with American plans by allowing his forces to be caught in the hammer and anvil that Westmoreland had so carefully designed. Instead, Thanh issued orders to his subordinate commanders in War Zone C, directing them to avoid large-scale engagements where American firepower could be brought to bear, to disperse their forces and move them toward the Cambodian border, where they could cross into sanctuary if necessary, and to focus instead on ambushing small American units, attacking supply convoys, and generally making the Americans pay a price for their presence in War Zone C, without accepting the kind of decisive battle that Westmoreland wanted. This directive would set the stage for the battles at Prek Klok and other engagements during Junction City, where American forces found themselves fighting company and battalion-sized actions against enemy forces that attacked and then withdrew before American reinforcements could arrive, or before the full weight of American firepower could be applied. The morning of February 22, 1967, began with B-52 strikes pounding suspected communist positions in War Zone C in the pre-dawn darkness, with each aircraft dropping dozens of 500-pound and 750-pound bombs from altitudes so high that the bombers themselves were invisible to anyone on the ground, creating massive explosions that walked across the jungle in lines of fire and thunder designed to destroy enemy positions, or at least keep enemy forces with their heads down while American troops moved into their assault positions. At 7:20 in the morning, a battalion of 1st Infantry Division troops began loading onto 70 helicopters for an air assault near the village of Khatum, in the northern part of War Zone C. And this was just the beginning of a massive helicopter operation that would continue throughout the morning as additional battalions were lifted into landing zones around the perimeter of the horseshoe-shaped operational area, with the helicopters making multiple trips back and forth between their pickup zones and the landing zones, each time exposed to potential enemy fire, but protected by gunships that flew alongside the transport helicopters, ready to suppress any ground fire. At the same time the helicopter operations were underway, another dramatic event was taking place to the north, where at 9 o'clock in the morning, 845 men of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, 173rd Airborne Brigade, along with paratroopers from an attached artillery battery, Battery A of the 3rd Battalion, 319th Field Artillery Regiment, began jumping from 13 C-130 transport aircraft flying over a drop zone 3 kilometers north of Khatum, and this jump represented the realization of something that Army airborne officers had been lobbying for since the beginning of American involvement in Vietnam, which was the opportunity to conduct a combat parachute assault, demonstrating that airborne forces were still relevant in modern warfare, despite the advent of helicopter air assaults that could put troops on the ground without requiring them to jump out of aircraft and drift down under parachutes while exposed to enemy fire. General Westmoreland had approved the parachute assault partly because he himself had been a paratrooper earlier in his career and understood the symbolic and morale value of conducting a combat jump, and partly because the logistical requirements of Operation Junction City were so enormous that using the C-130s to drop troops by parachute freed up helicopter assets that could be used to move other units into their positions. The paratroopers who made that jump were following a tradition that stretched back to World War II and the great airborne operations in Europe and the Pacific. And they were acutely aware that this might be the only combat jump any of them would ever make. That this was something special that would set them apart from the ordinary infantry who rode into battle aboard helicopters or trucks or armored personnel carriers. And the jump itself went remarkably smoothly considering the risks involved, with the descending paratroopers taking only sporadic small arms fire from the ground that was quickly suppressed by helicopter gunships circling the drop zone, and with only 11 men injured during the jump itself, mostly from hard landings or from colliding with equipment bundles or with other paratroopers during the descent. Once on the ground, the paratroopers quickly assembled into their units, gathered their equipment bundles that contained everything from ammunition to radio batteries to extra water, and began moving to secure the drop zone and establish their positions as part of the Northern Blocking Force for Operation Junction City. And within hours, the entire assault phase of the operation was complete, with American forces positioned around War Zone C, ready to begin the search and destroy operations that would characterize the next several weeks of combat. The initial results of Operation Junction City seemed to confirm American expectations, with objectives being reached without encountering significant resistance, and with the Hammer forces beginning their northward sweep on schedule. But what the Americans didn't yet realize was that most of the Viet Cong forces they had hoped to trap had already begun moving toward the Cambodian border, following General Than's directives to avoid a major engagement, and that the contacts that would occur over the coming days and weeks would follow a different pattern than what American planners had anticipated, with enemy forces initiating ambushes and attacks on their own terms, rather than being caught in the American trap. The 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, had been brought into Operation Junction City on February 23rd, lifted by helicopter from their base at Lai Khe, southwest to Suoi Da, where they took over reserve duties for the 3rd Brigade and were also assigned a portion of the Suoi Da defensive perimeter. And almost immediately upon arrival, they discovered just how dangerous their new area of operations was, when in the early morning hours of February 24th, their battalion area received approximately 120 rounds of 82mm mortar fire, concentrated into just a few minutes of intense bombardment that killed 2 soldiers, including a company commander, and wounded 5 others. A sharp reminder that the enemy was out there watching and waiting for opportunities to inflict casualties. 6 hours after that mortar attack, the battalion was airlifted again, this time to positions along Route 4 north of Suoi Da, where after considerable work-clearing jungle, they went into a night defensive position on the east side of the road, about 6 kilometers south of Prek Klok, where an artillery base defended by the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Infantry Regiment, was located, and where engineers were busy constructing an airfield and a Special Forces camp. The battalion commander was Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Lazelle, who had previously commanded the battalion for about a month in mid-1966, before being wounded by a bullet to the elbow that required evacuation to the United States for treatment. And when he returned to Vietnam in November of '66, General William Dupuy, who commanded the 1st Infantry Division, had restored him to command of his old unit, a testament to Lazelle's competence and to the confidence his superiors had in his leadership abilities. On February 25th, the battalion suffered several friendly fire incidents that, while they didn't cause serious casualties, served as reminders of the confusion and danger that characterized combat operations in the jungle, including an incident where one of the battalion's own 81mm mortar rounds fell short and landed near American positions, injuring 2 soldiers, and another incident where their position was hit by 50 caliber machine gun rounds from an American mechanized unit, conducting reconnaissance by fire at dusk, fortunately causing only damage to an 81mm mortar rather than casualties. The next 2 days, February 26th and 27th, were relatively uneventful, with the battalion conducting routine security operations and patrols without making significant contact with enemy forces. But at 8 o'clock on the morning of February 28th, everything changed when Company B of the 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry, departed its overnight defensive position along Route 4 and moved east on a search and destroy mission, with their objective being the Prek Klok stream approximately 2.5 kilometers to the east. Captain Donald Ulm commanded Company B, and he moved his company with platoons in column formation, which was standard procedure for movement through thick jungle, with the 3rd platoon taking the lead position, followed by the 2nd platoon, then the 1st platoon, with Ulm's command element positioned between the 2nd and 1st platoons, so that he could maintain control of the entire company while not being so far forward that he would be caught in the initial contact if the lead platoon ran into enemy forces. The company's progress through the jungle was agonizingly slow, as it always was when moving through the thick vegetation that characterized this part of Vietnam, with soldiers having to push through vines and undergrowth and climb over fallen trees and brush that the military called deadfall that was encountered every 50 to 75 meters. And as they moved forward, they employed what was called a cloverleaf search pattern, where they would move about 500 meters, then halt and send out small patrols in several directions to sweep the area in circular patterns, looking for signs of enemy presence, then reassemble and move another 500 meters before repeating the process. The company had completed 2 of these cloverleaf patterns and had advanced a little over 1 kilometer from their starting point when the 3rd platoon, which was in the lead, made contact with an enemy force to their front, and within seconds the jungle erupted with the sound of automatic weapons fire, RPG rockets, and mortar rounds impacting in and around the American positions. What Company B had just run into, though they didn't know it at the time, was the 2nd Battalion of the 101st North Vietnamese Army Regiment, which was moving through the same area on its way to conduct ambush operations along Route 4, and the 2 units had literally bumped into each other during movement. One of those chance encounters that happened occasionally in the jungle, where visibility was measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters, and where even large formations could move close to each other without being detected until they were practically on top of each other. The initial burst of fire hit the 3rd platoon hard, with the platoon leader being wounded and incapacitated within the first few minutes of the contact. And at that point, Platoon Sergeant Matthew Leonard, who was 37 years old and a veteran with 18 years of service in the Army, including combat in Korea, took command of the platoon and began organizing the defense against what was quickly revealed to be a much larger enemy force attacking from multiple directions. Matthew Leonard had been born in Eutaw, Alabama on November 26, 1929, and he had entered the Army in 1949 from Birmingham, serving initially during the Korean War and then continuing his military career through the 1950s and early 60s, eventually volunteering to deploy to Vietnam. Even though at age 37 with 18 years of service, he was getting close to retirement age and could have reasonably stayed in a safer assignment back in the United States. He was married to Lois Leonard, his childhood sweetheart, whom he had met when she was in 6th grade, and he was in 8th grade at their segregated school in Alabama, and together they had 5 children who were waiting for him back home. And Lois would later recall that before he deployed to Vietnam, Matthew had told her with an eerie certainty, "I have to die in Vietnam," as though he somehow knew or sensed that this deployment would be his last. On the morning of February 28, 1967, Matthew Leonard was serving as a platoon sergeant with the 3rd Platoon of Company B, 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment, and when his platoon leader went down wounded in the initial moments of contact with the North Vietnamese force, Leonard took command and would spend the next several hours demonstrating the kind of leadership and courage that would earn him the Medal of Honor posthumously and make him the first Black American soldier of the 1st Infantry Division to receive the nation's highest award for valor. The situation that Leonard faced was desperate from the beginning, with his platoon suddenly under attack from what appeared to be a much larger enemy force employing not just small arms, but also automatic weapons, RPG rockets, and hand grenades, and with the jungle terrain making it difficult to see more than a few meters in any direction, or to establish clear fields of fire. Leonard quickly rallied his men and organized them to throw back the initial enemy assault, shouting orders and encouragement, moving from position to direct fire, and generally doing everything a good platoon sergeant is supposed to do when his unit is in contact with the enemy and fighting for its survival. During the short pause that followed the repulse of that first assault, Leonard worked frantically to organize a defensive perimeter, redistributed ammunition among his men so that those who had fired heavily during the initial contact would have full loads, and inspired his soldiers through his forceful leadership and his words of encouragement, telling them that they could hold, that reinforcements were on the way, that they just needed to hang on and keep fighting. As the enemy began massing for another assault, Leonard noticed one of his wounded men lying outside the defensive perimeter, exposed to enemy fire, and in danger of being captured or killed if the enemy overran that position, and without hesitation, Leonard crawled out from the relative safety of his position and began dragging the wounded man back toward the perimeter. And it was during this rescue attempt that a North Vietnamese sniper's bullet struck Leonard's left hand, shattering bones and tissue and causing a wound that would have been enough to get most men evacuated from the battlefield and sent to a rear area hospital. Leonard refused medical attention, refused evacuation, refused to do anything except wrap some bandages around his shattered hand and get back to commanding his platoon. And as the enemy assault intensified once again, Leonard continued moving around the perimeter, continuously exposing himself to the increasing volume of fire as he directed his men's defensive efforts and tried to coordinate with Captain Ulm and the rest of the company. The fighting continued for hours that must have seemed like days to the men of 3rd Platoon, with the North Vietnamese launching multiple coordinated assaults against the American position, each time probing for weaknesses in the defensive perimeter, each time trying to find a way to break through and overrun the position, and each time being thrown back by the defensive fire that Leonard was orchestrating from position to position, despite his wounded hand, and despite the constant danger from enemy fire that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. The soldiers who survived would later describe the battle as a continuous roar of noise, with M16 rifles firing on full automatic, the deeper boom of grenades exploding, the crack of AK-47 rounds passing overhead or striking trees and equipment, and through it all, Leonard's voice shouting orders and encouragement, telling his men where to shoot, telling them to conserve ammunition, telling them that they could hold until reinforcements arrived. His leadership providing the backbone that kept the platoon together and functional even as casualties mounted, and the situation seemed increasingly desperate. At one point during the battle, the platoon's M60 heavy machine gun, which was one of their most important weapons, and which had been providing critical suppressive fire against the attacking North Vietnamese, jammed at exactly the worst possible moment when enemy forces were massing in the jungle for another assault. And without that machine gun firing, the North Vietnamese would have a much better chance of breaking through the American defensive line. Leonard, seeing that the machine gun had gone silent and understanding immediately what that meant for the survival of his platoon, ran to the machine gun position through enemy fire that was so intense that later witnesses would say it was a miracle he wasn't killed during that run. And when he reached the machine gun crew, he began working the weapon's mechanisms with his one good hand, his left hand being essentially useless now after being shattered by the sniper's bullet, trying to clear the jam while bullets cracked past his head and RPG rounds exploded nearby, showering him and the gun crew with dirt and debris. The machine gun jam was cleared, probably due to a combination of Leonard's efforts and the gun crew's work, and the weapon began firing again, sending bursts of 7.62 millimeter rounds into the jungle where North Vietnamese soldiers were preparing their assault. But then the position took a direct hit from enemy fire, possibly from an RPG or from concentrated small arms fire, and the gunner and his assistant were both wounded, leaving the machine gun silent again at another critical moment. Leonard, without hesitation, and without any apparent regard for his own safety, personally manned the machine gun and began firing it into the enemy positions, using his one good hand to operate the weapon as best he could, pouring fire into the jungle to suppress the North Vietnamese attack that was developing. And his action in taking over the machine gun and continuing to fire it, despite his wounds, inspired the other men of the platoon and gave them the kind of example that combat leadership is really all about. Not giving orders from a safe position in the rear, but being at the point of greatest danger and showing through your actions that you're willing to do whatever is necessary to complete the mission and protect your men. When Leonard realized that the enemy machine gun position that had been causing casualties among his men needed to be neutralized if the platoon was going to survive, and when he saw that no one else was in a position to do it, he made the decision to personally lead a charge against that position, running forward with his rifle in his one working hand, firing as he moved, screaming for his men to follow him, and inspiring them through his example to get up from whatever cover they had found and charge forward into enemy fire with minimal cover or concealment between them and the North Vietnamese position they were assaulting. This was the kind of action that wins battles at the small unit level, the kind of aggressive leadership that turns defensive situations into offensive actions, that seizes initiative from the enemy even when the tactical situation seems to favor the enemy. And Leonard's charge succeeded in silencing the enemy machine gun position that had been such a threat to his platoon. But the charge cost Leonard his life, with multiple bullets striking him in the chest and abdomen and legs as he ran forward, wounds that no combat medic could treat in the field, and that would have required immediate evacuation to a field hospital if there had been any chance of saving him. And he collapsed near the silenced enemy position that he had just helped neutralize, his strength and his blood finally giving out after hours of fighting with a shattered hand, and now with multiple additional wounds that would have incapacitated most men much earlier. The soldiers who were with him during those final moments would later say that Leonard remained conscious for a short time after he fell, that he continued trying to direct the defense of the platoon even as he was dying, that his last thoughts and words were about his men and whether they would be okay, and that he only stopped fighting when death finally claimed him there in the jungle, far from his home and his family. Matthew Leonard died there in the jungle near Suoi Da on February 28, 1967, giving his life so that his platoon might hold their position until reinforcements could arrive, and Captain Ulm's after-action report and the statements of survivors made it clear that Leonard's actions had been decisive in preventing the North Vietnamese from overrunning the 3rd Platoon during those critical first hours of the battle. Company C of the 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry, eventually fought their way through to relieve Company B, and by mid-afternoon, the combined American force had repulsed the North Vietnamese attacks, with Company B having suffered 25 killed and 28 wounded during the fight, but having inflicted at least 167 confirmed kills on the enemy, and an unknown number of additional casualties that the North Vietnamese managed to drag away before American forces could count them. For his actions that day, Platoon Sergeant Matthew Leonard was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, with the citation reading in part, "His fighting spirit, heroic leadership, and valiant acts inspired the remaining members of his platoon to hold back the enemy until assistance arrived." And President Lyndon Johnson would present the medal to Leonard's widow, Lois, at a ceremony at the Pentagon on December 19th, 1968, nearly 2 years after Matthew's death. While the Battle of Prek Klok on February 28th had involved an infantry company on a search and destroy mission making unexpected contact with a North Vietnamese battalion during movement, the Second Battle of Prek Klok on March 10th represented a different tactical situation, with Viet Cong forces deliberately attacking a fixed American position in what appeared to be an attempt to overrun the fire base and inflict a significant defeat on American forces that could be used for propaganda purposes and to demonstrate that even heavily defended American positions were vulnerable to determined attack. The fire base at Prek Klok, designated Fire Support Base 2, had been established as part of the network of artillery bases that provided fire support for American operations throughout War Zone C. And on the evening of March 10th, the fire base's defensive perimeter was being secured by the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Infantry Regiment, a mechanized unit commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Collins, minus Company B, which was deployed elsewhere, while inside the perimeter were the headquarters and 2 firing batteries, Batteries B and C of the 2nd Battalion, 33rd Artillery Regiment under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Daniel, along with elements of the 168th Engineer Battalion who were working on constructing a Special Forces camp and airfield in the area. The firebase's defensive arrangement followed the standard wagon train pattern that mechanized units used, with M113 armored personnel carriers arranged in a circular perimeter around the firebase, their machine guns and small cannons providing both protection and a substantial amount of defensive firepower that could be brought to bear quickly in any direction. And inside this perimeter were the artillery pieces themselves, along with ammunition storage, command bunkers, and all the other infrastructure required to keep an artillery battalion operating in a combat zone. The firebase's location along Route 4, approximately 20 kilometers north of Nui Ba Den, made it strategically valuable for supporting operations throughout the northern part of War Zone C. But it also made it a tempting target for Viet Cong forces, who understood that successfully attacking such a position would demonstrate their ability to strike at American forces even in their prepared defensive positions. American intelligence had detected signs of enemy movement in the area around Prek Klok, with radio intercepts and reports from patrols suggesting that Viet Cong forces were operating nearby in possibly significant numbers. But as was often the case with intelligence in Vietnam, these reports were vague enough that they didn't provide specific warnings about when or where an attack might occur, and the soldiers manning Fire Support Base 2 on the evening of March 10th were preparing for what they hoped would be a routine night of perimeter defense, not knowing that at that very moment, 2 battalions of the Viet Cong, 272nd Regiment, perhaps 1,000 men in total, were moving through the jungle toward their position, maneuvering into assault positions that would allow them to attack the fire base from multiple directions simultaneously. The assault began at approximately 10 o'clock in the evening, when the firebase suddenly came under a heavy mortar bombardment, with approximately 150 mortar rounds, a mix of 82 millimeter and 120 millimeter rounds, impacting throughout the firebase over a period of about 10 minutes, creating enormous explosions that sent shrapnel scything through the air, damaged equipment, wounded soldiers, and generally created the kind of chaos that the Viet Cong hoped would disorganize the American defense and make it easier for their infantry to penetrate the perimeter. The mortar barrage was immediately followed by RPG-2 rocket fire and recoilless rifle fire, targeting the M113 armored personnel carriers that formed the outer defensive ring, with the Viet Cong gunners trying to knock out these vehicles and create gaps in the defensive perimeter that their infantry could exploit. And then came the infantry assault itself, with Viet Cong soldiers charging out of the jungle from the north and east and southwest, firing their AK-47 assault rifles and SKS carbines as they ran, throwing hand grenades, screaming to intimidate the defenders and to coordinate their assault. The American response to the Viet Cong assault on Fire Support Base 2 demonstrated exactly why attacking a prepared American defensive position was such a dangerous undertaking for enemy forces. Because while the initial mortar barrage had caused some casualties and damage, the firebase's defensive preparations and the immediate reaction of the American forces transformed what the Viet Cong had hoped would be a successful attack into a killing ground where superior American firepower systematically destroyed the attacking forces. As soon as the mortar attack started, the American artillery batteries inside the firebase began firing the defensive concentrations that had been pre-registered around the entire perimeter, meaning that artillery forward observers had already plotted coordinates for likely enemy approach routes and assembly areas. And all they had to do was call in those pre-registered concentrations, and the howitzers would immediately begin firing at those coordinates without needing to conduct any time-consuming calculations or adjustments. As the Viet Cong assault developed and American observers could see where the main attacks were coming from, they adjusted the artillery fire toward and onto the attacking forces, walking the shells in closer and closer to the defensive perimeter. And at the same time, they called for additional artillery support from other American bases in the area, with bases 4 and 3, along with other artillery positions at Prek Klok, beginning to fire on the area around the fire base, creating a massive concentration of artillery fire that swept the jungle with high explosive shells that created enormous blast waves and sent shrapnel flying through the vegetation, cutting down Viet Cong soldiers and forcing others to take cover or break off their assault. The artillery fire was so intense that the ground shook continuously, and the noise was absolutely deafening, with shell after shell impacting around the perimeter. And by the end of the night, American artillery units would fire over 5,000 rounds in support of the firebase, an absolutely staggering amount of ammunition expenditure that demonstrated both the scale of the Viet Cong assault and the massive firepower advantage that American forces enjoyed when they could bring their artillery to bear. While the artillery was pounding the Viet Cong forces outside the perimeter, the 3rd Brigade's forward air controllers were directing airstrikes by Air Force fighters that arrived overhead within minutes of the initial contact. And to coordinate between the artillery fire and the airstrikes, American commanders designated Route 4, the main highway that ran past the firebase, as a fire coordination line, meaning that to the west of the road, the artillery would fire, while to the east of the road, American aircraft would attack, preventing any possibility of aircraft flying through artillery fire or artillery shells impacting where American aircraft were dropping bombs. When the first Air Force flight arrived in the area, the pilots could see the firebase under attack with tracers arcing through the darkness and explosions lighting up the jungle, and they began making bombing and strafing runs against the Viet Cong positions, dropping 500-pound bombs and 1,000-pound bombs that created enormous explosions, firing rockets that streaked down from the aircraft, trailing smoke and flame before impacting in the jungle with sharp detonations, and strafing with 20-millimeter cannons that could fire hundreds of rounds per minute and chew up jungle vegetation and anything hiding in it. The massive use of artillery and airstrikes was the main reason for the eventual American victory, because while the Viet Cong soldiers who had launched the assault were brave and determined fighters who had trained for this operation and who understood the risks they were taking, they simply couldn't sustain their assault in the face of that level of firepower. And after about an hour of intense fighting, the main Viet Cong attack had been repelled, with the surviving attackers withdrawing back into the jungle, dragging their dead and wounded with them when they could, but leaving behind nearly 200 bodies that American forces would count the next morning when they conducted battlefield sweeps. The American casualties at Fire Support Base 2 were remarkably light, considering the scale of the attack, with only 3 soldiers killed and 38 wounded, and this casualty ratio of roughly 1 American for every 65 Viet Cong demonstrated the enormous advantage that American forces had when fighting from prepared defensive positions where they could bring their firepower superiority to bear effectively. The 2 battles of Prek Klok, one on February 28th and another on March 10th, were not isolated incidents, but rather represented a pattern that characterized much of Operation Junction City, and indeed much of the war in Vietnam, where American forces with superior firepower and technology would engage Viet Cong or North Vietnamese forces in battles that produced high enemy casualties, but failed to achieve the kind of decisive strategic results that American commanders were seeking. The fundamental problem, which some American officers understood, but which the overall strategy didn't adequately address, was that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese could always choose whether to accept battle or to withdraw, could always retreat across the Cambodian border into sanctuaries where American forces were prohibited from following them, and could always rebuild their units with new recruits and continue fighting, whereas American forces were constrained by political considerations and rules of engagement that prevented them from taking the war directly to the enemy's sanctuaries and supply routes. After the Second Battle of Prek Klok, Operation Junction City continued for another month, with American forces conducting search and destroy operations throughout War Zone C, and engaging in several more significant battles, including the Battle of Ap Bao Bang on March 19th, where the Viet Cong 273rd Regiment attacked both Fire Support Base 20 and an ambush position established by elements of the 3rd Squadron, 5th Cavalry, resulting in heavy fighting before the VC Regiment was forced to retire under heavy American artillery and airstrikes, with American forces reporting 227 enemy killed and 3 captured against American losses of 3 killed and 63 wounded. On March 21st, the VC 272nd Regiment, the same unit that had attacked Prek Klok 11 days earlier, launched another attack, this time against Fire Support Base Gold near Soi Tre, where American forces of the 3rd Brigade, 4th Infantry Division were operating, and once again the attack was bloodily repulsed by massive American firepower. The pattern was consistent. Viet Cong or North Vietnamese forces would attack American positions or ambush American units. American forces would respond with overwhelming firepower. The enemy would suffer heavy casualties and withdraw, and then a few days or weeks later, the same thing would happen again somewhere else. By the time Operation Junction City concluded on April 15, 1967, American forces calculated that they had killed 2,728 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers, captured 34, and convinced 139 to desert or defect, while also capturing 100 crew-served weapons like machine guns and mortars, and 491 individual weapons like rifles. And they had destroyed numerous base camps and supply depots and captured large quantities of rice and ammunition and equipment. The operation had employed enormous resources, including 366,000 rounds of artillery ammunition, over 4,000 Air Force sorties, and 3,235 tons of bombs, and it had demonstrated the utility of airborne and mechanized forces in terrain that had previously been considered problematic for their use. But Operation Junction City had also demonstrated the fundamental strategic challenge that would plague American efforts throughout the Vietnam War, which was that tactical victories measured in enemy body counts and weapons captured didn't translate into strategic success in achieving the goal of defeating the communist insurgency and securing South Vietnam as an independent, non-communist nation. American intelligence learned after Junction City concluded that the Viet Cong had moved most of their main force units across the border into Cambodia rather than accepting decisive battle, that COSVN had never been located or even seriously threatened during the operation, despite that being one of the primary objectives, and that within weeks of American forces withdrawing from War Zone C at the conclusion of the operation, Viet Cong forces had returned from their Cambodian sanctuaries and re-established their presence in the area. The border sanctuaries in Cambodia, which had previously been primarily logistics areas, were expanded dramatically as a result of Junction City, with the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese establishing more extensive base camps and supply depots just across the border where they could train, re-equip, and prepare for future operations while remaining safe from American attack, due to the political constraints that prevented American ground forces from operating in Cambodia. Matthew Leonard's Medal of Honor. Citation provides a window into understanding what combat leadership looks like at the small unit level, and why the actions of one platoon sergeant on one morning in February 1967 mattered enough that the nation's highest award for valor was deemed appropriate recognition for what he did. The citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." His platoon was suddenly attacked by a large enemy force employing small arms, automatic weapons, and hand grenades. Although the platoon leader and several other key leaders were among the first wounded, Platoon Sergeant Leonard quickly rallied his men to throw back the initial enemy assaults. During the short pause that followed, he organized a defensive perimeter, redistributed ammunition, and inspired his comrades through his forceful leadership and words of encouragement. Noticing a wounded companion outside the perimeter, he dragged the man to safety, but was struck by a sniper's bullet which shattered his left hand. Refusing medical attention and continuously exposing himself to the increasing fire as the enemy again assaulted the perimeter, Platoon Sergeant Leonard moved from position to direct the fire of his men against the well-camouflaged foe. Realizing the enemy's superior numbers and the need for firepower, he ran through a withering hail of fire to secure a machine gun and place it in position to cover the area, running back and forth to bring additional ammunition to the gun. Under constant fire, he adjusted the machine gun's fire and inspired his men to resist the enemy attack. When an enemy grenade landed on the parapet near a wounded man, Platoon Sergeant Leonard immediately kicked it into a hole in the parapet, and when it exploded, absorbed the full force of the blast with his body. His heroic example and outstanding leadership inspired the men of his platoon to hold off the enemy attack and enabled the company to move forward to support the hard-pressed unit. His conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the cost of his life above and beyond the call of duty are in the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. What this citation describes, in the formal language that the military uses for such documents, is a man who repeatedly chose to put himself in danger to save others, who refused to quit even when wounded, who led by example rather than from behind, and who ultimately gave his life so that his men might live. This is the essence of what the military means when it talks about leadership, and it's worth understanding that Leonard's actions on February 28th weren't unique in the sense that countless other American soldiers, sergeants, and officers performed similar acts of courage in Vietnam and in other wars. But they were representative of the kind of small unit leadership that allowed American forces to prevail in tactical engagements, even when the strategic situation was ambiguous or unfavorable. Leonard was 37 years old when he died, older than most of the men he led, a career soldier with 18 years of service who had been through Korea and who understood what combat meant. And he made the conscious choice to volunteer for service in Vietnam when he could have stayed in a safer assignment and waited out his remaining time until retirement. His widow, Lois Leonard, struggled after his death to maintain her composure for the sake of their 5 children. And when she received the Medal of Honor from President Johnson at the Pentagon ceremony in December 1968, she was accepting recognition not just for her husband's bravery, but for the sacrifice that military families make when they send their loved ones off to war. And Sergeant Major Henry Cobb, who was one of the 6 men from Leonard's platoon who survived the Battle of February 28th because of Leonard's actions, later lobbied for a special memorial service in Birmingham, Alabama, that was attended by Army Chief of Staff General William Westmoreland in 1970. And Cobb spent years making sure that Leonard's sacrifice was remembered and honored. Leonard was initially buried at Shadow Lawn Cemetery in Birmingham, but in 2000, after Lois contacted veterans organizations about moving him to a more dignified resting place, his remains were moved to Fort Mitchell National Cemetery, where they rest today under a headstone marked with the Medal of Honor. Operation Junction City revealed several important truths about the war in Vietnam that would become increasingly apparent over the coming years, but which some American commanders were already beginning to understand by the spring of 1967. The first truth was that American forces could win virtually any tactical engagement where they could bring their firepower superiority to bear, as demonstrated at both battles of Prek Klok, where American casualties were light and enemy casualties were heavy. But that tactical victories didn't necessarily translate into strategic success because the enemy could always withdraw, regroup, and return to continue fighting. The second truth was that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese had excellent intelligence about American operations and movements, which meant that they could often avoid battles that were unfavorable to them, and could choose when and where to engage American forces on terms that minimized American advantages, as General Than had done by ordering his forces to disperse and move toward Cambodia, rather than accepting the decisive battle that Westmoreland wanted. The third truth was that the Cambodian border sanctuaries represented a critical strategic advantage for the enemy, providing them with a safe haven where they could rest, refit, and prepare for future operations without being subject to American attack. And that American rules of engagement that prohibited ground operations in Cambodia were a significant constraint on American military effectiveness. The fourth truth, which was perhaps the most troubling from an American strategic perspective, was that the attrition strategy that Westmoreland was pursuing, while it could inflict heavy casualties on enemy forces, wasn't working in the sense that it wasn't convincing the North Vietnamese leadership to abandon their goal of reunifying Vietnam under their control. And in fact, the North Vietnamese seemed willing to accept essentially unlimited casualties in pursuit of that goal. Whereas American public opinion and political constraints meant that American casualties couldn't be sustained indefinitely without generating political pressure to change strategy or withdraw from Vietnam entirely. Operation Junction City killed over 2,700 enemy soldiers, according to American calculations. But within weeks of the operation ending, enemy forces had returned to War Zone C and resumed operations. And nothing fundamental had changed in the strategic situation, despite all the resources and effort that had been expended. The fifth truth was that the American strategy of trying to locate and destroy COSVN, the supposed Supreme Communist headquarters, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the enemy command structure actually worked, with American intelligence imagining COSVN as something like a mini Pentagon with a fixed location and permanent infrastructure, when in reality it was a much more flexible and dispersed organization that could move quickly to avoid detection. And that didn't depend on maintaining a single, fixed headquarters location. This misunderstanding would persist throughout the war, with American operations continuing to search for COSVN without ever finding it, because what they were looking for didn't exist in the form they imagined it. Beyond the strategic and tactical lessons of the battles of Prek Klok and Operation Junction City, there was the human cost that such operations exacted from the soldiers who fought in them, and from their families back home who waited for letters and dreaded the arrival of Western Union telegrams or uniformed officers at their doors, bearing news that their son or husband or father had been killed in action. Matthew Leonard's widow Lois received the news of her husband's death on February 28th, and she would later recall how she struggled to maintain her composure so that she could break the news to their 5 children in a way that wouldn't traumatize them more than was unavoidable, and how in the weeks and months that followed she had to figure out how to support 5 children as a single mother, while dealing with her own grief over the loss of the man she had known since childhood. The man who had told her with such certainty that he would die in Vietnam, as though he had some premonition of his fate. The 28 other American soldiers who were killed in the various engagements around Prek Klok in late February and early March of 1967, each had their own stories, their own families who mourned them, their own futures that were cut short in the jungles of Vietnam. And while the Medal of Honor citation for Matthew Leonard was read at the Pentagon, and his widow received the nation's highest recognition of his sacrifice, most of the other families received only a telegram, a flag, and whatever personal effects could be recovered and sent home. And they had to find ways to live with the knowledge that their loved one had died in a war that was becoming increasingly controversial and whose ultimate purpose was being questioned by growing numbers of Americans. The 3 Americans killed in the Defense of Fire Support Base 2 on March 10th, and the 38 who were wounded returned to units that would continue operating in Vietnam, and some of them would be wounded again or killed in subsequent engagements, while others would complete their tours and return home to try to readjust to civilian life after experiencing the intensity and trauma of combat. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers who were killed at Prek Klok, the roughly 200 killed in the attacks on the fire base, and the 167 killed in the ambush of Company B, also had families and futures, and while American forces counted their bodies and recorded them as statistics in after-action reports, these were human beings who had believed in their cause, who had been willing to die for the goal of reunifying Vietnam under their control, and who left behind parents and wives and children who mourned them, just as American families mourned their losses. The difference was that the North Vietnamese leadership was willing to accept those losses as the price of victory, while American political leaders and the American public were increasingly questioning whether the cost in American lives was justified by the strategic objectives being pursued in Vietnam. The battles at Prek Klok took place at a specific moment in the broader trajectory of American involvement in Vietnam, coming in the spring of 1967 after 2 years of large-scale American ground operations and before the Tet Offensive of January-February 1968 that would fundamentally change American public perception of the war. In early 1967, the American military presence in Vietnam was approaching its peak, with over 400,000 American military personnel in country, and more arriving every month, and the strategy being pursued by General Westmoreland was still the official policy of the Johnson administration, despite growing questions from some quarters about whether that strategy could actually achieve its objectives. The spring of '67 was a time when some American military leaders were still expressing optimism about the war's progress, pointing to operations like Junction City as evidence that American forces were inflicting heavy casualties on enemy forces and disrupting their operations. But it was also a time when cracks were beginning to appear in that optimistic narrative, as it became clear that heavy enemy casualties weren't translating into strategic progress toward the goal of securing South Vietnam. The fact that Operation Junction City, the largest American operation of the war to that point, involving the equivalent of nearly 3 divisions and employing massive amounts of firepower and resources, had failed to achieve its primary objectives of locating and destroying COSVN and of decisively defeating the Viet Cong 9th Division, should have been a clear signal that the attrition strategy wasn't working as intended. But American military and political leaders were deeply invested in that strategy and weren't ready to acknowledge its fundamental flaws. So instead, they focused on the tactical successes and the enemy body counts and the weapons captured and the base camps destroyed, while downplaying or ignoring the fact that within weeks of the operation ending, enemy forces had returned and resumed operations in War Zone C. This pattern of claiming success based on tactical metrics while ignoring strategic failures would continue throughout 1967 and into '68, until the Tet Offensive shocked American political leaders and the American public into recognizing that the optimistic assessments they had been receiving from military commanders didn't match the reality of the situation in Vietnam. The battles at Prek Klok, in this broader context, represented both the strengths and the limitations of American military power in Vietnam. The strength was demonstrated by the fact that in both battles, American firepower and training allowed them to inflict heavy casualties on enemy forces while suffering relatively light casualties themselves, showing that in direct combat engagements, American forces were more than a match for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. The limitation was demonstrated by the fact that these tactical victories didn't contribute meaningfully to achieving strategic objectives, because the enemy could absorb the casualties, withdraw when necessary, and continue fighting, while American political constraints prevented American forces from taking the war to the enemy's sanctuaries, or from pursuing strategies that might have been more effective, but would have required escalation or expansion of the war beyond what the Johnson administration was willing to accept. The American military was and is an organization that takes pride in its ability to learn from experience, to analyze operations and battles, and derive lessons that can be applied to future operations. And after Operation Junction City, concluded there were extensive after-action reviews and analyses conducted at various levels of command, trying to understand what had worked, what hadn't worked, and what could be done differently in future operations. Some of the lessons that emerged from these analyses were tactical in nature, dealing with things like the effectiveness of pre-registered artillery defensive concentrations in defending fire bases, or the challenges of coordinating artillery and airstrikes in the same battle space, or the importance of having sufficient helicopter assets available to move reinforcements quickly when units made contact with enemy forces. These tactical lessons were generally well understood and were incorporated into training and doctrine for future operations. But there were also strategic lessons that emerged from Junction City that were less well understood or less willingly acknowledged by American military and political leaders. One of these strategic lessons was that search and destroy operations, no matter how large or how well executed, couldn't achieve decisive results against an enemy that could choose when to accept battle and when to withdraw, and that had access to sanctuaries across international borders where American forces couldn't follow. Another strategic lesson was that body counts and weapons captured, while they might look impressive in after-action reports and press briefings, weren't meaningful indicators of progress toward achieving strategic objectives, because the enemy could replace casualties and weapons and continue fighting as long as they maintained the will to do so, and as long as they enjoyed support from North Vietnam and from external patrons like the Soviet Union and China. A third strategic lesson, perhaps the most important one, was that the American strategy of attrition assumed that there was some level of casualties that would be unacceptable to the North Vietnamese leadership and would cause them to abandon their goal of reunifying Vietnam. But this assumption was fundamentally flawed because it failed to understand that for the North Vietnamese, this was a war of national survival and national destiny, a continuation of their struggle against colonial powers that stretched back decades, and they were willing to accept, essentially, unlimited casualties in pursuit of victory. Whereas, for the United States, this was a limited war with limited objectives being fought far from American shores. And American public opinion and political realities meant that American casualties couldn't be sustained indefinitely without generating pressure to change strategy or withdraw. This asymmetry in willingness to accept casualties meant that an attrition strategy favored the side that was willing to take more losses, which in this case was the North Vietnamese rather than the Americans, even though American firepower superiority meant that in tactical engagements the Americans would inflict heavier casualties on the enemy than they suffered themselves. These strategic lessons weren't completely ignored. Some American officers and analysts understood them and tried to argue for different strategies. But they weren't accepted or acted upon at the highest levels of American military and political leadership, partly because acknowledging these lessons would have required admitting that the current strategy wasn't working and would require a fundamental change in approach, and partly because the alternatives to the attrition strategy all had their own problems and limitations. Pursuing the war more aggressively by striking enemy sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos, or by expanding operations into North Vietnam, would have risked widening the war and potentially bringing China or the Soviet Union more directly into the conflict, which was something American political leaders wanted to avoid, while pursuing a more defensive strategy focused on pacification and protecting the South Vietnamese population would have required abandoning the initiative and accepting that large parts of South Vietnam would remain under communist control, which was politically unacceptable to the Johnson administration. The battles at Prek Klok in February and March of 1967 are not among the most famous battles of the Vietnam War. They don't have the name recognition of Ia Drang, or Khe Sanh, or Hue, or Hamburger Hill, but they deserve to be remembered because they exemplify so much of what the Vietnam War was about, both in terms of the courage and sacrifice of the individual soldiers who fought, and in terms of the strategic challenges and contradictions that characterized the American war effort. Matthew Leonard's Medal of Honor stands as a testament to the kind of leadership and courage that American soldiers displayed in Vietnam, showing that even in a war whose strategic purpose was increasingly questioned, individual soldiers continued to perform acts of extraordinary heroism and self-sacrifice for their comrades. And Leonard's story deserves to be told and remembered alongside the stories of other Medal of Honor recipients whose actions in Vietnam demonstrated the best qualities of the American military tradition. The two battles at Prek Klok also stand as examples of American tactical proficiency and firepower superiority, showing that when American forces could bring their artillery and air power to bear in defense of prepared positions, they could inflict devastating casualties on enemy forces while suffering relatively light casualties themselves. And this tactical proficiency should be acknowledged and appreciated, even while recognizing that tactical victories alone weren't sufficient to achieve strategic success. The soldiers who defended Fire Support Base 2 on March 10th, standing their ground under mortar fire and infantry assault, and using their superior firepower to repel attackers who outnumbered them, demonstrated the kind of tactical skill and discipline that made American forces formidable opponents in direct combat, and they deserve recognition for their performance in that battle. At the same time, the battles at Prek Klok stand as examples of the fundamental strategic challenges that plagued American efforts in Vietnam, showing that even large-scale operations like Junction City that employed massive resources and achieved impressive tactical results couldn't overcome the basic problem that the enemy could choose when to fight and when to withdraw, could find sanctuary across international borders, and could continue fighting as long as they maintained the will to do so, regardless of casualties. The fact that American forces killed over 350 enemy soldiers in the two battles at Prek Klok and suffered fewer than 30 killed themselves would seem to represent a decisive American victory, but the strategic situation in War Zone C wasn't fundamentally changed by those battles, and within weeks enemy forces were operating in the area again, demonstrating that body counts and casualty ratios, while they might be impressive from a purely military standpoint, weren't sufficient measures of success in a war where the enemy's strategy was based on persistence and willingness to accept casualties rather than on achieving battlefield victories. The soldiers who fought at Prek Klok, both American and Vietnamese, both those who died there and those who survived, were caught up in something much larger than themselves, in a conflict that was shaped by Cold War geopolitics and American domestic politics and Vietnamese nationalism, and countless other factors that individual soldiers on the ground couldn't control or fully understand. They did their duty as they understood it, fighting with courage when called upon to fight, following orders, looking out for their comrades, trying to survive and complete their tours and get home to their families. And whether the war they were fighting was justified or wise or achievable in its objectives wasn't something they could determine or change. But the question remains important for understanding what happened at Prek Klok and in Vietnam more broadly. Today, more than 50 years after the battles at Prek Klok, the village itself is part of modern Vietnam, and the area where Fire Support Base 2 once stood and where Company B, 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry fought their desperate battle on February 28th, is now jungle again, or perhaps farmland, with little physical evidence remaining of what happened there in the spring of 1967. The Americans who survived those battles are now in their 70s or 80s if they're still alive, and the Vietnamese who fought there are of similar ages. And for both groups, the battles at Prek Klok are memories that may have faded with time, or may still be vivid and immediate, triggered by sounds or smells or anniversaries that bring them back to that time and place. Matthew Leonard's name is inscribed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., along with the names of the other Americans who died at Prek Klok and the nearly 58,000 other Americans who died in Vietnam, and visitors to the memorial can touch his name and remember his sacrifice, even if most of them don't know the specific circumstances of how he died or what he did to earn the Medal of Honor. The lesson of Prek Klok If there is a single lesson to be drawn from those battles, is perhaps that courage and sacrifice at the individual level don't guarantee success at the strategic level, that tactical proficiency and firepower superiority don't ensure that a war's objectives can be achieved, and that even the bravest soldiers fighting with the best equipment and training can find themselves caught up in conflicts where military victory proves elusive because the fundamental strategic and political challenges haven't been adequately understood or addressed. This lesson isn't comfortable or uplifting, doesn't provide the kind of clear moral narrative that we might prefer, but it's important for understanding not just Prek Klok or Junction City or Vietnam, but military conflict more broadly and the relationship between military means and political ends, the complex interplay between what soldiers can accomplish on the battlefield and what political leaders can achieve through the application of military force. Wars are ultimately decided not by who wins battles, but by who achieves their political objectives. And the battles at Prek Klok, for all the courage displayed there, and for all the tactical proficiency demonstrated by American forces, didn't contribute meaningfully to achieving American political objectives in Vietnam, which is both a tragedy for those who fought there and a reminder that military power alone, no matter how overwhelming, isn't sufficient to guarantee strategic success when the political foundations of a conflict are poorly understood, or when the enemy's will to continue fighting exceeds your own willingness to sustain casualties in pursuit of limited objectives.